Good morning, everyone. Thank you for taking your time out of your weekend to come here and listen to us talk. Today, we're going to be embarking on a fascinating journey as we dive into the complex world of intergenerational wealth transfer and estate planning. Or at least we're going to try to make the topic of death and estate planning as engaging as we can. This is a subject that reaches beyond the boundaries of financial planning, impacting the wider world in profound ways, influencing economies, molding societies, on a personal level, shaping families. So some of the discussion points that we're going to talk a little bit about today is deemed disposition. We're going to talk a little bit about taxation issues. We're going to run through some real world case scenarios and how they're going to affect you. We're also going to talk about tax alpha, and we're going to talk a little bit about wills and trusts. A little bit about us. Today's medical professionals grapple with the challenges of managing finances on multiple fronts, from corporate financials to personal money matters and taxes. They kind of often rely on lawyers, accountants, investment advisors, and bankers who tend to work in isolation, lacking efficient communication and collaboration. Consequently, these individuals are left to navigate the complexities of their financial lives, feeling overwhelmed and uncertain about the path forward. And what we are integrated wealth planners. What exactly is that? We're strategic partners and project managers for the physician's finances. We develop comprehensive financial plans that coordinate the efforts of all the professionals you rely on. Our goal is really just to educate and really simplify your financial life and help you reduce your stress. I myself, I have about 15 years of experience in the financial services industry. I have an MBA in accounting. I'm a certified financial planner. I'm a chartered life underwriter, and I'm also a chartered investment manager. I've worked at both large asset management companies and banks. And more recently, I had a stint at a prominent accounting firm where I actually worked with one of the CPAs, Matt McComb, that you'll be hearing from later today. I'll pass it over to Nick to talk a little bit about himself as well.
Great, thanks Simon. It's great to meet everybody. So much like Simon, I've got 10 plus years serving Canadian business owners and professionals when it comes to their financial life, financial planning, integrating their wealth and their estate wishes, navigating the complexities of today's financial landscape. My background does include being in an upper management level position at a large Canadian coast-to-coast financial institution. I do work with clients one-on-one. We have a strong team, coast to coast, Simon being one of them. I believe we have another individual, Lloyd Mitchell, on the call, who's another one of our financial planners on the team. And we're really here to help safeguard your financial futures. We want to protect your assets. We want to give you maximum growth, and we want to give you a safe haven where you can feel comfortable asking complex questions and know that we're here to help support you and make good decisions.
So the terrain we'll be navigating today is complex, but it's also immensely relevant. We'll commence with a broad view of its importance, examining how intergenerational wealth transfer isn't merely a financial concept, but also a socio-economic event with far-reaching implications. We'll transition into a deep dive into the mechanics of how wealth transfer is done, explore the various tools and structures that make this process possible. We'll also look closely at the challenges that can arise from taxation complications to unwanted outcomes, while also trying to recognize some of the opportunities this process presents as well for wealth preservation and legacy building. Finally, we will wrap up our discussion with strategic insights on how to effectively navigate this complex landscape. At its core, intergenerational wealth transfer is the passing of wealth from one generation to the next. This can occur through a variety of mechanisms, including inheritances, wills, trusts, gifts, and even strategic business succession planning. Although the concept may seem to primarily concern the affluent, it is a universal issue that affects us all, either directly or indirectly. It shapes societies, it influences economic stability, and it plays a pivotal role in our personal finances. The scope of the wealth transfer. Consider for a moment the vast scale of intergenerational wealth. We're not merely talking about billions of dollars, but trillions being transferred across generations globally. This massive wealth transfer, often referred as the Great Wealth Transfer, marks a never-seen shift of wealth from baby boomers to essentially their beneficiaries. The implications of this event are enormous, affecting the world as a whole, but we're not here to talk about that specifically today, but we're going to really focus on how it's going to affect you on a personal level. The mechanics of intergenerational wealth transfer. The process of it extends beyond just the simple act of writing a will, which is what a lot of people think it is. It encompasses the careful management of estates, the plannings of one's wishes, the establishment and operation of trusts, and the navigation of taxes. It's a process that demands strategic planning, informed decision-making, and often expert guidance. Whether the wealth in question is tied in family business, real estate, stocks, bonds, or other investments, the process of transferring wealth can be complex, but with the right advice and tools, it can be efficiently managed to ensure wealth preservation. So there are a lot of challenges. The path of wealth transfer is not without its challenges. Disputes can happen. Deemed disposition must be considered. Contention over inheritance and complexities surrounding taxation are all common challenges that can arise. However, within these challenges, there also lies opportunities. The process of wealth transfer opens doors, allowing families to contribute to the greater good. It facilitates legacy building. It ensures that a family's impact can be felt for generations to come. And it allows for continuity, enabling the preservation of family businesses and other assets. As financial planners, we play a vital role in guiding families through this process just beyond the numbers. So I'm going to actually pass it off to Nick here to chat about some real world case studies, what the issues that can actually arise are, and maybe what some of the potential solutions are. So I'll give it to you, Nick.
Yeah, thanks, Simon. So taking a deep dive into the challenges, and we've heard about this a little bit earlier today with Jean-Pierre and even with Andrea, and we'll probably hear about it again. You know, with these concepts being so important, we want to hear them over and over and over again to make sure that we're not having anything slip through the cracks. So deemed disposition, it's a key concept in Canada's tax law. It's actually the idea that even if you haven't actually sold an asset, it's considered as if you did for tax purposes, and you may owe capital gains tax. So this concept becomes especially relevant during intergenerational wealth transfer. When an individual dies, their assets are going to be subject to deemed disposition. This means that for tax purposes, all assets are considered as having been sold at the fair market value on the date of the individual's death. The estate may then owe taxes on any capital gains. Intergenerational wealth transfer can, therefore, be significantly affected by deemed disposition. And it's crucial to understand this concept when planning an estate and considering how to best pass this wealth down to the next generation. Because we know what's tied to wealth is taxation. And taxation ultimately is the #1 destroyer of wealth. Sometimes we know it's coming, sometimes we don't. Proper planning is important. I wanted to highlight what Simon and I typically see in a lot of professionals' financial life when it comes to where are they going for advice? How come things sometimes are falling through the cracks? How come they're having to maybe look after everything on their own? So we do typically see that, and we've got a couple down there, where they might have a little bit of a core team. They might have a slight integration there in their corporate side of their planning. So they probably have someone that helped them draft their corporation documents. They might have a lawyer. Hopefully they've consulted with a tax specialist. The accountant might be the tax specialist, but generally there's an accountant there in the team. And hopefully they're getting a little bit of advice on how to properly structure their corporate planning. But then they have all these other professionals. They might have them on the personal side, and they may have them in the corporate side as well. But they're generally dealing with financial planner of some sort, or at least hopefully financial advisor maybe. They might be doing their own investments and or working with an investment advisory team. They hopefully have somebody talking to them about estate planning. They might have some private equities, some private investments, maybe some exempt market type solutions, investing in things that are not available on the regular stock exchange. And they probably have a bank. They might even have 5 banks. But this structure right here, what we notice is that you're having to be the project manager of everything going on, both personally and corporately, and trying to make sense of the entire financial picture and the entire financial scope. When it comes to passing wealth to the next generation, what does this structure generally result in? So the problem with the model is there's lack of communication and teamwork between the professionals. A lot of times, the personal planning is not aligning with the corporate planning. And we're going to touch on that in some case studies later as to why this can be so important when it comes to the next generation taking on our wealth. And at times, some of the professionals on your team might not be so professional, and they might not be working together in a professional manner. So what happens? Well, we see a lot of inefficiencies. We see a lot of increased costs. We see unbelievable missed opportunities, huge wasted time, and a lot of times mitigated risks, poorly mitigation of risks. You're the project manager, right? It's a very reactive approach versus proactive. But what about if your structure was a little bit different? And this is where we talk about integrated wealth planning. So we bring someone like Simon, Lloyd, myself, the team that we work with, we bring those into the core, working with your accountants, working with your tax specialists, working with your core team. And then a lot of the exterior relationships, they work with your core team as well. So what do we call this? We call this an integrated advisory experience, where now you're no longer the quarterback or the project manager of trying to coordinate in your already busy life and your already highly demanding profession, a core team that can help make this transition of wealth doable, easy, and reducing missed opportunities. So you really become chairs of your own advisory board for your family and for your MPC or your medical professional board. We've already seen this example today, but I find it so important to see this example time and time again, because we are constantly speaking with and working with physicians that they just unfortunately didn't know. And maybe through their team, they're not being told this, that when they pass away, if they have RSPs, there's going to be something negative that happens here. So let's look at very high level example. JP already touched on this, but let's look at deemed disposition on death of a physician who has $2 million. While similar to JP, we got to use a fancy calculator and it spits out a not so nice or fancy number. So if this physician were to pass away with a $2 million, not only in their RSP, maybe they're retired, maybe they're 70, 80 years old, and it's still $2 million inside their registered retirement income fund. So this is an RSP that you're already starting to draw some income on. While the total tax on that wealth transfer, when it can't go to a spouse, because maybe there's not a spouse there, it's going to now go to the next generation. The government gets pretty excited because they see that $2 million and they say, we're going to get $1 million of that. So your next generation, although you saved, you did the right things, you put money away, you were diligent, you made sure you weren't invested in too risky of stuff, you did everything right. But now when it goes to the next generation, they immediately lose half. Not such a great scenario. We heard from JP as well. Is there a better way? Physicians want the ability to save in a registered environment. I want to be able to put money away, receive a deduction today so that I have $1 saved for $1 earned. And I can defer my tax to a later date when I decide to draw income off of this solution and use it. Well, you still have a registered vehicle. It's not the RSP that has a successful way to pass it to the next generation. But a registered pension plan, if you're in IPPs, PPPs, CPPP, you can name your children as additional plan members. And if that same $2 million was sitting in the defined benefit account of someone's registered pension plan, Even though the top marginal tax rate in Ontario was 53%, the full 2 million will go to the next generation. Over $1 million in savings because of proper planning, proper awareness, and not missing opportunity. So JP, again, he touched on this. It's not eligible for multi-employer pension plans, right? And this is a special concept called pension surplus. So being financial planners ourselves, I'm sure Simon and Lloyd can attest, this is actually not taught or talked about in certified financial planning designations. So it's not unrealistic that the professionals you may or may not be working with might not have known of this special feature that goes along with certain types of pension plans. Although this special feature, when you have a full integrated wealth planning team that's working together, we're not missing this opportunity, and we can maybe divert retirement savings into a different vehicle that is going to allow for a better wealth transfer. Now let's talk about another thing that we commonly see. So we commonly see that corporations are being used as an investment vehicle. And we're not talking about pension plans, we're talking about just non-registered investments. We're going to be retaining capital inside of our company. We're going to be storing this up, stockpiling it up. Again, being careful with our investments, making sure we have some wins. We're not taking unnecessary risk, maybe we're just buying GICs, but we're using our corporation to save. And let's look at an example. Maybe this physician has invested and saved. Their adjusted cost base is what you have put in and saved, $3 million. But the fair market value of these investments is 7.4. You've more than doubled your money because of great choices, paying attention to opportunities, capitalizing on incredible opportunities to grow that money. And that's a great nest egg, $7.4 million. So the issue here is not, did you make good investment decisions? And did you grow your money in an appropriate way? The issue here is, how do we get this money to the next generation? And how do you get the money out of the corporation? Either you pass away prematurely or you pass away at your normal life expectancy, but this is still occurring inside your corporation. Well, we run the risk of 3 levels of tax on death. So let's explore, what are the 3 levels of tax? We'll dive into 2 right away. So heaven forbid you passed away, okay? Right away, we know there's going to be a personal tax. So this is your loved ones that are going to be inheriting the shares of your corporation. Let's assume that the value of the corporation is only the investment. Maybe it's in mutual funds or whatever. But when they inherit the shares of the company, they're going to have to account for a taxable capital gain. So the capital gain is the full amount. So the taxable portion is going to be 3.7 million. And being at, it's well over the highest rate in Ontario, let's just assume a 53% tax on inheriting the shares of your corporation. Well, that's a pretty nasty tax bill, right? $1.9 million of your hard-earned, hard-invested $7.4 million is going to be lost. Going to go to the government. And then let's look at the corporate tax, because this also is going to be a scenario. So we have a corporation here that has put $3 million in. It's grown to $7.5 million in the investment. So we have another capital gain. This capital gain will be the 7.4 minus 3 million. So it's 4.4 million. Taxable portion being half of that. 2.2 million is a taxable capital gain. Our corporate tax rate is going to be 50%. So yeah, it's a little bit lighter than our tax rate personally. You get to save a few points, few basis points, but it's still pretty nasty. So we have another tax bill, $1.1 million. So your $7.4 million has already been whittled down $3 million from these 2 taxes. But now, what's the third level? Because we're not done yet. How are your loved ones going to get this money outside of the company. We've got a fair market value. It's still going to be listed at 7.4 million. Corporation's going to have a tax, right? 1.1 million. There's going to be a refundable dividend tax on hand, which you'll get a little bit of that 1.1 million back, get 674,000 back. But our total dividend is going to be 6.9 and change, 6.9 million and change. Thankfully, it did create a bit of a credit to your capital dividend account. So you can pull out 2.2 million tax-free. But we still have a taxable dividend that has to come out. 4.7 million, 4.7 plus million. What's our dividend tax rate? Again, yeah, it's a little bit nicer than the corporate or the personal, but it's only a few basis points less. It's still 45%. So our dividend tax is going to be 2.1, almost 2.15 million. That's 7.4 million that is being left behind for your beneficiaries has a total tax bill of 70%. You've invested 3 million and your family is inheriting less than $3 million. They're inheriting barely, not even $2.2 million after the 3 levels of tax upon passing. So we talked about these 3 levels of tax, right? The deceased pays tax, family pays tax, and your medical professional corporation will pay tax. Yikes. Is there a better way? This is just one example of a solution. It's kind of a complicated looking graph, but again, we're just trying to say, is there a better way? Well, with proper planning, proper integrated wealth team working together, calculating out these tax bills and realizing that nobody wants to pay $5.2 million of their $7.4 million in taxes if they were to pass away. They want that money to go to their family. So maybe they implement what's known as a corporate estate strategy, most commonly used with corporate insurance. Well, if we make a proper plan for the corporation and its investments, the first layer of tax we can significantly reduce is our taxes payable on the dividends to the beneficiary. With this strategy, we can create a capital dividend account in which we can pay the beneficiaries with a capital dividend payment tax-free. So we've taken care of that first layer of tax. The second layer of tax we can avoid is the taxation on the investments inside the corporation. So inside of a tax sheltered vehicle, like a corporate estate strategy, we can avoid the high tax rate on passive investments inside the corporation when the physician would have passed away. So we've taken care of that second layer of tax, or potential full amount of that layer of tax. And that third layer of tax we can avoid is on the terminal tax return of the deceased. Here we can create a capital loss. Create a capital loss in the estate, which we can carry back to the terminal tax return, and we can offset the capital gains. So every situation is unique, and thus every situation should properly be evaluated before implementing any kind of strategies like this. However, this solution could potentially save 3 massive layers of tax. When we talk about tax alpha is something that you may or may not have heard of, or might be a new concept to you. But really, it refers to a strategy in financial planning and trying to be tax smart. So when we think alpha is just the additional return we can earn on an investment benchmark. So if you're a do-it-yourself physician, or you're a do-it-yourself investor, you're probably very familiar with the term alpha. So tax alpha is referring to the extra return we can achieve by effectively managing your taxes. So remember, going back here, this is not effectively managing taxes. This is losing more money, our family inheriting less money than our original $3 million that was invested. And we more than doubled our money in the savings that we had. So that would be tax alpha, properly planning against something like that. Physicians have a lot to worry about. They have to worry about the capital gains tax. There is probate, but probate is relatively low on the tax scale, although still important and still adds to our tax alpha. We have to consider income attribution rules, the taxes on split income. A few others, Simon actually mentioned earlier, family dynamics. So sometimes wealth transfer can create even family conflicts, especially in the perception of unequal treatment among heirs, right? We could potentially have some other scenarios that come up. So when we look at tax alpha, we're also looking for legal methods to reduce our tax liability and trying to just keep more of your money. It is hard enough to run a successful practice. It is hard enough to work hard and get burnt out. We all know what the burnout has been over the last so many years now, since COVID. So time is valuable to keep your money. By applying tax alpha strategies, we can use the tax system to work in our benefit, and we can allow you to grow more wealth through financial planning and wealth management. So we've got another case study here. Again, a very common scenario for a successful physician is the passing of rental properties. So let's look at a scenario here. We've got a very successful physician who has acquired 4 rental properties. They've found some good deals. These rental properties were purchased for $250,000. So we'll call that our adjusted cost base. So that's the purchase price per rental. But these rental properties have also done well. They've now grown to $1.25 million each property. So this real estate portfolio is $5 million. An amazing turnaround on $1 million out, receiving income all the way along, most likely having other people pay down our liabilities. And now we have an asset or multiple assets that have grown to $5 million. Well, now we have a situation where physician has passed away. So what does he do? Writes in the will, I'm going to leave my properties to my children. So what happens? Well, let's assume that the estate has cash on hand of about $500,000. We have a fair market value of $5 million. Remember, deemed disposition. It's deemed disposed on fair market value. Our adjusted cost base, what we spent, can be subtracted from that when we're thinking of transferring the wealth, but this is only $1 million. We have a big tax situation here. Our estate has $500,000 in it, but we have 4 properties that we have $1 million of capital gains that we have to deal with. So half of that is taxable, $500,000. Pay tax on half of that gain, $250,000. So the tax bill is now just as much as you spent to buy the properties. Just the math happened to work out in this situation. Now you got to ask yourself, how is the estate or the children going to handle this tax bill? They have $500,000 tax on hand, so they can deal with 2 of the properties if they wanted to keep them. But this bill is due. What ends up happening? We generally have a fire sale situation. I know Dr. Tran mentioned fire earlier. This is the opposite kind of fire. We don't want this kind of fire. This is a fire sale, and it better happen quickly because we have to deal with a tax situation. Now we know the property's worth fair market value $1.25 million. But generally what we see when people are trying to unload a property quickly, especially in markets like we have right now, where we're having a bit of a correction taking place. This wasn't too big of an issue when markets were going crazy and people were bidding 2, 3, 400,000 on houses that 200,000, 300,000 over asking on houses they hadn't even seen, but it was a frenzy. Well, now we're in an opposite situation. We might see this property get sold for $1 million. So what happens now? We have no house. We had to get rid of, quickly liquidate one of our properties just to handle tax, just to deal with the tax bill. And this is a very, very, very stressful situation for loved ones that inherit property. I can give an example where I had my in-laws, they inherited a farm. They had to float the farm 3 years before they could find a buyer. They had to float all the costs of that property before they could find a buyer. Thankfully, the farm was a principal residence, so they didn't have this tax problem, but they still had to float a property. Imagine a massive farm and the tax bill and the ongoing expense of just maintaining it so that it's on the market for 3 years, not looking like it's falling apart. And they listed it at 3 million and ultimately only got 1.5 million 3 years later. So passing down properties is not always as clean and not always as expected. Sometimes it results in a very stressful situation for the next generation. And now you might also say, well, what if I add them while I'm alive? Well, when you add children while they're alive, there's a couple things that you might have to worry about. What if there's future marital property claims? What if your children are married and they get divorced? They own half of a property. What if creditors come knocking for one of your children while you're alive and they're alive and you co-own a property? There's a lot of family dynamics there. It's not as easy as just making one of your children a co-owner of the property. Our fourth case study is now talking about wills. And we're going to cover a couple topics here. One is intestate, and another is they just have outdated final wishes. So let's assume a scenario. And again, we're not trying to be over the top. Oh, sorry, Simon, I was going to actually punt this over to you. I think I've talked for about a half an hour, so I'm going to punt this off to Simon. Simon, you're going to go down the will conversation.
Okay. Yeah, let's talk a little bit about the scenario here. Let's say this physician, he passes away with a spouse and an adult child, and he was quite young. And what ends up happening a lot of times is when you're younger, you don't expect the unexpected to happen, and unfortunately, you don't create a will. And a lot of times, people don't understand what the consequences of that are, and what some of the actual events that can actually happen are. And again, let's continue with this example that maybe the spouse is 100% dependent on this physician's income and she is disabled right now. And the child, has been kind of he's financially independent. He left at a very young age and he is estranged from both parents. And the intention was really for this physician to leave everything to the spouse because they wanted to make sure that their spouse was taken care of, regardless of what happened to them. And they didn't really want to leave anything to the child because he was financially independent and estranged from the entire family. Next slide. So the physician thought his estate was pretty simple. He thought his net worth was about $1 million. This is after taxes. And what happens when you die intestate is that oftentimes the assets are not distributed to your beneficiaries the way you want them to. What typically ends up happening is that they get distributed according to laws and rules that are put in place specific to each province. So let's take a look at what happens specifically to this physician that lives in Ontario. So what ends up happening is the first $350,000 will go to the spouse of the $1 million. So that's great. She's gotten some money. That's exactly what he wanted. Let's see what happens with the rest of the money here. The remaining $650,000 in this case will be divided equally between the spouse and the child. So unfortunately, what ends up happening is the child that they didn't want to get money because he is financially independent and he does have he is estranged and he does have means to take care of himself, but not necessarily the spouse, they will get a huge chunk of this money. So what ends up happening is that 50% of that 650,000 will still go to the child, even though that was not the intention of the physician. Click on. So not having a will is bad, but sometimes there's also causes that can invalidate a will as well that we have to keep in mind. There's capacity. Maybe the will is challenged in court and that this physician's, even if he had made a will, his capacity while making the will is challenged, and it's said that he didn't quite make it appropriately under the right mindset. Lack of valid execution. So maybe there wasn't proper signatures, proper witnesses. It wasn't done according to the provincial laws, which invalidate that will. Lack of knowledge and approval. Maybe the physician didn't really understand what he was signing over, didn't really read things over, and they were able to prove that he didn't really understand that the will was done properly. Again, it invalidates the will. There could be, again, a failure to provide adequate provision for a spouse and child. Sometimes we see this happen, especially with family disputes, where either a spouse is estranged or a child is estranged, and they don't want to leave any money for that child or other spouse, and they try to cut them out of the will, but they're dependent on the money that's being provided by the physician. Unfortunately, this could also invalidate that portion of the will. And undue influence. I mean, again, if the physician is under stress and duress while making the will, such as he is, being manipulated by someone that has power over him to leave them some money, this could also cause it. So again, even if you do make a will, these are things that are really important to consider that may invalidate wills so that you still end up in intestacy court. Okay, next slide. So let's talk a little bit about the final case study we're going to talk about here. I'll try to get through this one quickly, which is how trust plays into estate planning. Let's talk a little bit about this doctor. For this example, let's call him John Doe. He's currently single. He's got 2 adult children. His wife passed away 5 years ago. He feels that even though his estate is sizable, it's simple, and he has made a will in this case. So unlike the previous doctor, he does have a will. So John feels comfortable that everything has been taken care of. His intentions are very simple. He just wants to leave everything to his 2 sons to make sure they would be financially taken care of in case something happened to him. And he wants whatever's left over to go to his grandchildren so they can also benefit from his sizable estate. So let's talk a little bit about his 2 sons. His youngest is currently 18 years old. Since losing his mom at a young age, his youngest son has grown up to be a bit of a wild child. He didn't have much supervision from his busy father and usually had to take care of himself. He tends to have poor impulse control and is a bit of a spendthrift and is very generous with his friends. He currently doesn't go to school, but John really hopes that he'll follow in his footsteps and become a doctor. The oldest is very different from his brother. He's married. He has a kid. He has a wife. He has a great job as a corporate lawyer. He, unlike his brother, is very responsible with money. Although one thing John has noticed is that his oldest son has been fighting with his wife a lot. Tragically, the next day after this, John was hit by a car. He passes away. He leaves $2 million net worth to both his kids. $1 million paid to each son's bank account as per his will's instructions. John thought everything he did was right. He paid very little taxes because of good planning with his CPA, and the money passed to his kids quickly. So what else could he ask for? So let's talk a little bit about some of the issues. As the money goes directly to the beneficiaries, it becomes exposed to their issues, whether or not that is good. So it could be poor spending, it could be liability issues, and John's wishes to take care of his kids and his grandkids might not happen. So let's take a quick look at what happens to both these kids after 3 years of inheriting this money. Let's fast forward 3 years into the future. Unfortunately, the oldest does get divorced. The marital problems get worse. It was a very messy and stressful divorce. he lost half his inheritance to his ex-wife. He went through a very hard time with this separation, and he also lost his job due to negligence at work. He messed up on a large client case, and the client sued him. So he also had to declare bankruptcy. So unfortunately, due to this, he lost both the inheritance to both bankruptcy and to a divorce. The youngest also had a very hard time dealing with losing both his parents at a young age. He didn't really know how to regulate or deal with the emotional trauma of what happened. He does what every other 18-year-old would do in that situation. He starts having fun to forget his troubles. He starts going on vacation, buys a nice condo, goes to nice restaurants, buys some nice clothes, gets a good car. After 3 years of spending, he's only left with $100,000. So let's talk a little bit about the scenario. Dr. John did everything right. He invested his money well. He did good in the markets. He tax planned well, reduced the estate tax. And even his financial plan showed that he was on his way to living his dreams in retirement. His estate was even transferred to his kids as per his wishes. However, the intention to take care of his kids and leave some of the estate to the grandchildren didn't happen like he wanted. His oldest, through unforeseen events, lost the money through divorce and bankruptcy. The youngest lost the money through poor spending habits. The sad part of this story is that it could have been avoided through proper planning. John may have potentially been able to set up a testamentary trust through his will that could have extended his wishes beyond his own life. If the trust had owned the assets, what potentially could have happened is the oldest would not have lost the assets to his divorce or bankruptcy. John could have controlled the flow of assets by setting up the trust instructions and saving the money from being spent irresponsibly by his youngest child. Again, this case study is a really good example of that estate planning is really unique to every person's situation, because unless the lawyer specifically knew about the family dynamics of both sons and their spending habits and what issues they were going through, besides just looking at the numbers, you can't really understand what's happening, and you can't just look at the taxes and numbers. So we're running out of time here, so we got a couple minutes, so I'm going to wrap it up. In conclusion, intergenerational wealth transfer is a powerful socioeconomic force. It's not merely a transactional process of transferring assets from one hand to another. Rather, it's about continuing legacies, ensuring financial security, and helping your family and potentially shaping economic landscape of the future. As such, understanding its mechanics, implications, and strategies to navigate it are the first step to proper planning. Thank you for your time today, and we'll maybe open it up to some questions here. And maybe I'll actually let Nick talk to see if he's got any finishing words here.
No, you wrapped it up there nicely, Simon. And as you can see, as Simon mentioned, very complex, very unique to each individual. And that's why it's so crucial to have your team and be a member of your advisory board of your own team.
Thank you very much for that, Simon and Nick. That was very, very comprehensive, very, very comprehensive. And it leaves, I think it leaves me more questions than answers. And that's why we need specialists like you guys to come and consult on. I have one question already, and the question is, does the RSP transfer to spouse tax-free? Like in that type of transfer, where is it taxed?
Yeah, that's a great question. So you can name your spouse as a beneficiary to your RSP, or once it's in the income status, a registered retirement income fund. And this money will roll to your spouse on a tax-free basis. So you do not have that concern of moving RSPs to a spouse, triggering any deemed disposition like you would going to your children.
Very good. I don't have another question on chat, but if you do have a question that's burning, you can unmute yourself if you want and ask those questions. So I will have a question for both of you guys. Like we've talked a lot about different solutions. How do you go about in designing a solution? Like, how does the pension fit in there? How does the trust fit in there? How does the insurance policy fit in there? Like, is there one after the other? Is there a particular mix that you guys see as probably the most efficient?
So maybe I can answer that. Yeah, I think that is really part of the financial planning process, Fu. A lot of times, when we sit down, I always I consider myself almost as if a client had come to us to build a dream house, we look at it like we're a general contractor and we're really there to just understand all the different clients' needs and goals. And we'll pull in different financial professionals to help us, from CPAs to lawyers to even investment advisors, to really kind of help set a lot of these goals in place. And when we're looking at this, that's where we are a little bit different, where we're not looking at one specific aspect of a client's finances. We're trying to understand their overall goals, from their estate planning to their tax planning to their investments to their to even their family dynamics. And what we're really there to do is kind of put all those pieces together and really help coordinate a solution that kind of covers all aspects of it. And that's really where we're a little bit different, is that we're kind of a little bit more of a generalist, that we're looking at all the different aspects versus just one specific aspect of a person's finances, such as the CPA might look specifically at a tax, lawyer might look specifically at estate plans, and investment advisor might look specifically at the investments. We actually take all those things into account before we come up with a plan.
Okay. There's a question: can you add grandchildren to your corporation?
Yeah, that's a great question. So that might be better suited for Matt, our senior CPA, coming on here towards the end. But speaking of it from a financial planner's point of view, there's going to be both advantages and disadvantages. And the outcome is, it's really going to largely depend on the specific circumstances, including the grandchildren's ages and their involvement in the business. So as an example, with pros, you might have opened up income splitting or adding them to the pension plan of something that you have established there. So if the grandchildren are adults, they could be involved in the business. There could be dividends paid to them for the work they're doing. If they're a shareholder, it could be potentially at a lower rate. However, you have to pay attention to this, the con side, have to pay attention to the tax on split income, or TOSI rules. So this can certainly be something that can happen during for private corporations, and it could be subject to the highest marginal tax rate. Another thing that could come up is potentially future claims. So if your grandchildren get into trouble financially or get divorced, the shares could potentially be claimed by creditors, or could be included in a division of marital property. Loss of control is another thing that comes to mind. So it really depends on the circumstance, having proper guidance and advice from your whole integrated wealth planning team, just to make sure that decision makes sense for you and your situation.
Thank you very much. Can you discuss maybe and elaborate on how trust works, and what are the benefits, and maybe also the drawbacks of trust?
For sure, yeah, I'll punt that over to Simon.
Oh, you're punting it over to me. Okay. Yeah, trusts are essentially a legal structure where essentially you would transfer your assets into a trust, and a trustee essentially would be the person that manages those accounts. The biggest advantages of having a trust is, like we had discussed in my example, that it separates the ownership of the assets from the actual person, the original testor that gave the money. This is advantageous in that it protects the money from claims of any of the beneficiaries. So if they've got liability issues, or even such as in my example, they had an issue when it came to divorce, it would protect the money because it's not actually owned by the beneficiary, the two sons, it was owned by the trust. And one of the other huge advantages of the trust when it comes to that kind of situation is that you can state within the trust documents how the money is going to be distributed within it through a number of different caveats that you can leave within the trust, and the lawyer can manage that for you. One of the biggest disadvantages, I would say, of a trust is that now that the money is in the trust, there are costs to run a trust, and they could get quite expensive, and these costs could be quite could be yearly that you're going to have to pay. And unfortunately, if your estate's not very large and you've got $100,000 estate and you're paying a few $1,000s a year in trust costs, that would immediately deplete the estate value really quickly. So trusts are usually more or less set up for a client that has assets that are a little bit larger. Another huge issue with trusts nowadays is that there's a 21-year disposition rule, deemed disposition rule. That means that if you do set up a trust for, say, your kids and grandkids, it actually every 21 years, the assets within the trust are deemed disposed of, causing tax issues within the trust. And I think one of the final things about the trust that I would say are a little bit disadvantageous is that, again, this could be a good or bad thing, is that the beneficiaries, again, don't necessarily have access to the money like they would like. Again, because you've specified how the money in the trust is going to be spent. It could be it could cause some family disputes, because maybe the kids thought they were going to get that $1 million clean and free into their names. They already picked out their car that they were going to buy. They thought they were going to buy a condo with that. And now they hear that they got this money in the trust, and the trust kind of specifies where the money is going to be spent. And I forgot one other advantage of a trust, especially in a family trust, is especially if you got multiple beneficiaries within a family, you can flow through a lot of the different income streams. So whether that be capital gains, dividends, or interest to the specific beneficiary, allowing the trust to actually split income with a lot of the beneficiaries. So there are still some tax advantages of having a trust as well. So that's just off the top of my head.
Okay, thank you.
I can also add to the last question as well, real quickly here. So that tax on split income, it gets talked about a lot, but again, this is where planning comes into play. So kids under 18 in a company, they can receive T4 income, and it's not going to apply if they're bona fide employees as TOSI rules, and thus we can and have seen children as young as 14 brought into the company collecting minimum wage part-time and being added to pension plans. And then, another comment here is when we talk about insurance. So we have seen things like insurance held inside and outside of pension plans, and that's a very unique thing when it comes to why you may want children as part of your corporation or grandchildren, getting them participating in a pension plan, as long as it's not one of those multi-employer ones. It's more private and registered with a sponsorship of your company. You may see benefit in having insurance as part of an asset inside your pension, or outside, or both, right? We've seen all kinds of combinations. So I just wanted to add that note.
Thank you. JP just put a comment there that trust property is subjected to a deemed disposition every 21 years, as you mentioned, Simon. And so, but this doesn't happen with the pension trust of the personal pension plan. So there is no 21-year deemed disposition with pension trust as opposed to testamentary trust. In speaking about trust, obviously this is not the place or time for it, but there are so many different types of trust. The one that you are talking about is testamentary trust, which is after death, because we're talking about intergenerational wealth transfer. But there are alter ego trusts, there are in vivo trusts, there are all sorts of trusts that are out there to help you plan. And again, the main point here, the key point here is plan. And what exactly are we planning for, right? We're planning for, as much money in your pocket as possible so that it doesn't get eroded by taxes. And so that's what all these trusts are helping you do. So definitely need a plan. I mean, I've gone through life haphazardly. Trust me, I've done it. I've like Katy Perry's song, you know, do you feel like a plastic bag drifting in the wind? Trust me, I've drifted in the wind for a long, long time financially, and finally got my stuff in order. But the planning aspect that you guys are talking about is absolutely crucial.